Kathy. So Jesus's triumphal entry into Jerusalem is the inaugural moment of Holy Week, of his passion and death. And it begins with a bang. And this is such a dramatic shift from Jesus's MO up to this point. Jesus has been reluctant, if not downright resistant, to the fame he is receiving in and around Palestine. If you'll remember, he's healed people and told them, don't go out and say anything to anyone about this. Or he escapes from the crowds to go off into a quiet place to pray by himself. He wasn't looking for fame at all. It's really clear through the Gospels, and if anything, just the opposite. Until the time came, until the great Kairos moment of his life. And then, as he sensed the time was ripe, he finally raised the curtain on the play and began the drama. Some refer to this, to Jesus's actions as enacted parables. So he told parables throughout his ministry, of course, that often made a point through story, through narrative, like with the Good Samaritan or the lost sheep or the prodigal son, fictionalized accounts that revealed something of the mystery of God and that often subverted the expectations of his listeners because, after all, he was trying to say something about the mystery of God. But there are other times, and then there are specifically the times that Jesus teaches, like the Sermon on the Mount. And then there are other times when Jesus teaches and reveals something not so much by his words, but by his actions. And there's another place in Israel's history where enacted parables show up, and that's with the prophets of Israel. And interestingly enough, their enacted parables often took place where? In Jerusalem, the holy city that was being visited by Jesus and his disciples on that day. So I'm thinking of the prophet Ezekiel, who, get this, he lay on his side in the middle of the streets of Jerusalem, it is said, for 390 days to represent how many years Israel had been sinning against God and to emphasize that his discomfort was nothing compared to what would happen to them as a result of their sin. Or Isaiah, who walked through the streets of Jerusalem stark naked for a while to make the point that Israel would be stripped of all that they had and taken into captivity by Assyria if they did not change their ways. Point well taken. There was also Jeremiah, who walked through Jerusalem with a big wooden oxen yoke around his neck, and then had someone come up and hack the yoke off of him as a symbol of God's promise to break the yoke of Babylon eventually after the exile. So you see, the prophets would not just set up a soapbox and preach on the streets. They would perform public acts that were impossible to ignore, that would be the talk of the town, that might even haunt someone's dreams. An effective teaching tool. So too with Jesus. This ripe time that he finally chooses to become the center of attention, to draw everybody's eye upon him, is not just any time in the busy city of Jerusalem. He chose the single busiest week in the life of the city, which was the week before Passover, known as the week of unleavened bread, when Jews from all over the known world would descend upon the city. Jerusalem was normally at this time about 50,000 people, but during the week of unleavened bread, when pilgrim Jews would come from all over for their annual high holy celebration of Passover, it became a city filled with triple that number, packed with over 150,000 people in a city usually containing 50,000. So that was the stage that Jesus walked onto. He sat on the Mount of Olives overlooking Jerusalem and the masses of busy people in and around that city. If you've ever been to the Mount of Olives, you know that sitting there, you get this beautiful view of the city. And he had his disciples get him a donkey so that he could ride into the city, a donkey. Now, anyone hearing Jesus's words or listening to this story told in that time and place, or soon thereafter, would note immediately what Jesus was doing by choosing a donkey to ride into the city. Because as far as we know up to this point, what we've heard in the Gospels is that he's been going on foot everywhere. We haven't heard of him getting on a donkey yet. But here, he says, get me a donkey. And yes, a donkey was a symbol of humility and peace, while a war steed or a horse was a symbol of war. So he clearly chose the donkey instead of the horse. So that's true that it speaks something of Jesus's purpose and method. But more importantly, the donkey in Israel's history was an obvious symbol of kingship. There were critical kingly moments in Israel's history that involved Jerusalem and donkeys. The great King David rode a donkey out of Jerusalem when his son Absalom organized a coup against him. And later, the wise King Solomon rode a donkey into Jerusalem at his coronation as king. So you see how explosive this little humble act of Jesus actually is, and not very humble actually. And it had the desired effect. There were enough people who had heard of him by then that it drew quite a bit of attention, and many people gathered along the road, as Kathy read to us, cheering and crying out to Jesus, Hosanna, Hosanna, which, remember, is not a synonym for hooray, but means save us, save us, save us. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. Jesus rides into Jerusalem proclaiming himself as Israel's king. What? What is he doing? As you can imagine, there's a wee bit of a problem with him doing this. For Jerusalem already has religious rulers who are quite self-satisfied in their positions of power and don't think there's any, overturning of power that is needed. And looming over the city that Jesus rides into is a palace of the actual king of Jerusalem that would be King Herod, who was king under, of course, the true king, Emperor Caesar. So this little antic of Jesus's is treasonous to the civil authorities and sacrilegious to the religious authorities. This display, anyone could have guessed, was going to get him arrested and likely killed. And there goes King Jesus, riding on a donkey through the streets of Jerusalem to the chants, save us, save us. A dangerous, dangerous point to be making. And once all eyes are on him, in typical prophetic fashion, where does he go inside the walls of Jerusalem? Well, he goes to the single most important place in the holy city, to the temple. For his parable was not complete with his mere dramatic entry into the city. No. He had more to say through his actions. And we know what happens there with all the eyes already on him. He goes to the temple, to the very heart and soul of the holy city, and he rages. He throws over tables of the money changers and drives the animals out, saying, "You have made my father's house a den of robbers." He, like the prophets before him, minces no words in condemning Israel's religious practices at the time for being wrapped up in ceremony and pomp while neglecting justice and integrity and righteousness. Justice, integrity, righteousness that God had created them to embody as a light to the nations. Instead, the temple was making money off of the backs of poor Jewish pilgrims who were required to purchase an animal to sacrifice for their celebration of Passover. He had had it. And in those days and in the days ahead, he was going to turn over more than just tables. He was going to place himself in the place of that very temple, turning over, or you might say, fulfilling 3,000 years of tradition by becoming himself the sacrificed animal, the sacrificed lamb, given for the sake of everybody. Everybody. The people would still have a long way to go to get that's what he was doing. And some would never get it at all. They would just see a sad, abandoned, painfully defeated human man. Though he had ridden into the city on a donkey proclaiming to be king, he would be eventually hanging bloodied and naked on a Roman wooden execution device, a cross. That's what most would see and turn away ashamed of him. God's path to victory for us came by way of his defeat, of Jesus's defeat. God's glory for us by way of Jesus's shame. God's hope for us by way of his utter despair. God's love for us shared by way of gathering all human violence and hate and fear and grief into himself and returning forgiveness and love. God's enduring life for us was assured by the way of Jesus' death. Amen.